Good morning, everyone. My name is Adam, and I'm a park interpreter here in Whiteshell Provincial Park. The Whiteshell is located on Treaty 3 territory, which is the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, and Métis Nation. I want to thank all of you for inviting me into your homes today to learn a little more about trapping. Now, of all the different methods of wildlife harvesting, including hunting and fishing, trapping is definitely the most misunderstood. I'm sure lots of people, maybe even some of us watching today, have heard horror stories from the past about how cruel trapping is, or how the animal is suffering and in pain when it's in a leg hold trap, or some of them starving to death because they're left in a trap so long, amongst other things. Now, if we were talking about trapping in the 1800s, everything I just said is 100% accurate. Back in that era, trapping absolutely was not humane by any standard, let alone the standards that we have today. But that was then, and this is now. Over the last few centuries, trapping has evolved by leaps and bounds, with Canada being at the forefront of developing new, modern, humane traps. Now, when I say humane traps, what the heck am I talking about? This trap right here is a soft catch leg hold trap that is able to be used today. And it's called a soft catch because if you take a look on the rim there, it's actually lined with rubber. But again, humane trap. How is it humane? What are we talking about here? Trust me, I have no pain tolerance. This doesn't hurt at all. So trapping in the whiteshell still takes place centuries later, and for a variety of reasons. It's a combination of people, it's just a way of life for some people. It's that time of the season, it's been passed down from generations, and that's what they do. It's also a modern, humane, and sustainable way of removing problem wildlife. So from going from a cornerstone industry that helped build this country to a humane, sustainable way of dealing with problem wildlife, like I said, trapping's evolved leaps and bounds with Canada at the forefront. So as we learn more about trapping, we can gain an appreciation for this misunderstood method of wildlife harvesting and ensure these techniques are not lost to history. Now, a minute ago, I mentioned the whiteshell is located on Treaty 3 territory. Now, Indigenous peoples hunted and trapped and even traded furs among neighboring Indigenous communities long before European fur traders ever set foot in North America. Animals that were trapped and traded for were some of the same ones that Europeans had an interest in, like some of the ones behind me here today. But some common examples would be things like this. This is from a rabbit. So the Ojibwe, which the Anishinaabe are a part of, would trap and hunt rabbits, usually in the winter. And this was done primarily by the women and children. They would set up snares around the border of the campsite. And snaring for rabbits is still one of the most common ways that people will trap for rabbits. So as far as what was done with the rabbit, the meat was eaten, and then the fur, it's unfortunate you can't touch this, it's nice and soft. This fur would be used to make things like clothes or garments. Everyone should know what this one is by now. This is, of course, the Canadian beaver, and the Cree would trap for beavers in the fall and winter months. And the way they did it was kind of cool. The trapper would set up a number of traps underwater along a river between all the different lodges. And the traps were basically weighted nets that were made out of tanned ungulate hide. Ungulate is a word for all of our hoofed and antlered animals. So at the time, these hides would have been from moose, woodland caribou, or mule deer. And they were woven together in a technique referred to as babachet, which is, by the way, the same technique they would use to make snowshoes during that era. So as far as the beaver goes, what would happen is the trapper, over the course of a couple of days, would walk up and down the river, checking all their traps to see if there were any beavers in there. That process, by the way, of going up and down their trap line is still used today, as in the Whiteshell, all trapping is done via a registered trap line system. So people, if they want to trap, they just can't go out and set traps wherever they want. They have to have a designated line that's in existence, and it's their line. So the trapper would go up and down checking for traps, for checking for beavers in the traps. And what would be done with the beaver is, again, the meat would be eaten, and the pelts would be kept for either making clothes or garments, as well as trading with other indigenous groups. And one thing unique with the beaver is the beaver secretes an oil called castor oil. They would groom it all over their body, and that helps keep them waterproof when they're underwater. Beavers don't hibernate. They're still active under the water at this time of year. So needless to say, yeah, I'd want to be waterproof too if I was doing that. The indigenous trapper would take that castor oil and they would save it and use it for bait in future traps. And they would trap all kinds of animals with it, including other beavers. And that method, by the way, is still used by trappers today in 2021. Before the Europeans came to North America in search of beaver pelts, the beaver and beaver hats were already in fashion in Europe, and they were trapping for beavers over in Russia and Scandinavia. Now, eventually, when those populations were pretty much depleted, the Europeans started looking at North America for a new population. And boy, did they find one. They came over, and unfortunately, much like the bison or the lake sturgeon, the beaver was trapped and hunted way beyond a sustainable level. And the numbers just went way down to the point of the beaver was almost extinct in North America. This was done mainly because at that time, from the 15 to 1800s, there were no trapping rules or regulations of any kind. And the trappers weren't talking to each other either. So there was really no concept of a sustainable level of populations or population decline. So that, combined with the fact that over in Europe, the beaver hats were kind of going out of fashion. Those two factors really spelt the end of the fur trade. But trapping did still continue. And like I said, it continues on to this day. Now, for a real good perspective of how trapping has evolved and modern trapping, let's take a look inside the Whiteshell Trappers Museum and talk to a real trapper from here in the Whiteshell. We're here in the Whiteshell Trappers Museum, located on the grounds of the Alfred Hull Goose Sanctuary here in Whiteshell Provincial Park. I'm here with Kyla today, who's a local trapper from here in Rennie. So Kyla, how did you get your start in trapping?
Well, the Whiteshell is mapped out in RTLs, which are registered trap lines, and my grandfather had his own line, number 12, as well as his brothers. Having that trap line, even though it was only maybe 3 or 4 decades ago, trapping was a source of income. And he lived at his trapper's cabin. No hydro, no water. So his children, as well as I, was raised up in that area. Back in the day, like it is now in northern communities, trapping is actually considered a hero status because it means you have an exceptional set of skills for survival and you're a good tracker. And people of your community and your home rely on not just the furs for warmth or clothing, it's actually a great source of food, and people use the meat as well as all parts of the animal to be repurposed. So now that I had my fondest memories on the trap line, being taught how to set and track and survive, I'm able to pass that to a 4th generation, which is my daughter, who is now 2 years old, sharing the exact same awesome experiences that I got to.
Oh, very cool. So Kyla, earlier in the webinar, I talked about a little bit how Canada is at the forefront of developing new, modern, humane traps. Now, I think a lot of people still, when they think of traps, usually something like this is what comes into their mind. However, traps like that you cannot use anymore, right?
No, they are illegal.
Absolutely. So could you talk a little bit about just how the physical traps themselves have changed over the last few years to become what we now know as humane traps?
Yes, the designs were effective and worked. That's why you could see the new ones are following similar patterns. But changes have been made. As you can see, there's a guard of rubber because you didn't need as much force as we originally thought were required. So all these awesome changes are great for also the handler using these. This is the good old famous conibear. Everyone who traps would recognize this one. It itself has also got changes made to it. This is a kill trap. So unlike a bullet that would stray from a bite on an animal, this is a guaranteed effective way. There is no longevity. This kill trap has had changes made to it only to strengthen it. It has the metal force, has a stronger density, and the springs have changed the length so that it has even a faster, more effective release. These footholds are the biggest new change. Having that softer grip has changed the way of trapping, because now the animal can be left live for release or observation.
Would we be able to see a demonstration of one of the kill traps?
For sure, we'll have that coming right up.
Awesome.
All right, this is the famous conibear. This is a 120. Traps like this are kill traps only. It's not meant to miss a vital or have an animal run. It's supposed to be instant. So these kill traps can vary in size. Larger is to target larger animal, but they all consist of the same parts. We're basically dealing with two safeties that are going to be released. You've got a dog, you've got the trigger, and the trigger is going to be set off and everything is going to be snapped and released. So it's going to be fast. So again, this one's now set. Once those triggers are hit, everything's going to be set off.
So Kyla, what are some of the common animals that people like to trap for in the Whiteshell today?
Well, from RTL to RTL, the landscape can be completely different. Mine, for example, has a river running right through it. So unlike a lot of the other ones, I have a species called muskrats that thrive there. And muskrats are like your common rat, and they repopulate at a very, very fast rate. As well as they carry the most parasites known to any other animal. Now those parasites are saying they could be linked to getting other animals in the food chain sick because they run up the riverbeds quite heavily. So I have to keep an eye on that population because like rats, it can escalate very quickly. As for the two common trapped animals, I would think the only two that conservation officers as well as trappers are getting calls about would be the wolf and the beaver. So starting with the wolf is an animal that is very elusive and travel in a pack. But when those numbers get high and disease starts to run through the family, they're going to get rid of the weak and the sick as fast as they can and avoid getting the rest of them sick, which doesn't always work, but in the first chance they're going to try. Those weak and sick are now on their own, and they start to venture into maybe public places because they aren't well. Public places have prey that are a lot easier to get than wild ones that are very fast. So when we start getting those calls that they're in public places, you really shouldn't be seeing them because they should be healthy and elusive. And if they're showing up, they're getting hungry. The second animal that we seem to get calls about the most, and probably always will be the famous and sometimes troublesome beaver. So this one flourishes well in the backcountry lakes. They need a lot of trees and a lot of landscape to eat and make their homes. And then once they fill up that backcountry lake, they'll end up picking a common lake. And once they fill up that lake, because they are rodent, they repopulate very quickly. And on the rare occasion, an inexperienced beaver will actually end up making a home on shallow ditch water along the provincial park highways. This is a problem for them because beavers don't understand that once the fall time comes and the water level drops, those channels they get to access their homes actually either stick above or predators grab them or freeze right out and then they can't access their feed anymore. So their fate is sealed. But before that happens and they realize they've made a fatal decision, they usually cause a lot of damage in the summer months. The water levels get high in the spring and they decide to wash out the provincial park highways, which can be troublesome because like 309 on my trap line, they actually tried to wash out the highway to Big Whiteshell. Not having access to the only way in and out of a provincial park road is dangerous because that was 500 cottagers, 500 campers, thousands of people in and out in the summertime that cannot leave, and there's no way an ambulance can access them if there was medical care needed.
That's some very cool examples about how trapping is still used today. So Kyla, to end off with, at the beginning of the webinar, I had talked a little bit about how trapping is definitely one of the most misunderstood methods of wildlife harvesting around. As a trapper, could you talk a little bit about what some of the misconceptions about trapping are?
Well, like any situation where people are involved with nature providing a renewable resource, there's going to be pushback. Trapping, hunting, farming, everything is under the eye of people watching because we're working so close with nature. But because we're around them, we really get to observe their habits, and we also get to see them at their worst, which is something trappers are well aware of. We get to see sadness in disease, starvation, illness. Diseases like mange are created to create high populations that have reached its peak. See, nature has this comfortable middle ground number where there's just the right amount of predators and prey, and everything's flourishes in that ecosystem. But all of a sudden, when it goes off balance and that predator system starts to reach a high peak, there's devastation. What it actually means is now everything on the food chain below that predator has now been almost erased, and it's going to now struggle for a long time to replenish. So now you're sitting at a very high number, which is dangerous. And that's what we're trying to prevent. We're trying to stop the high populated animals from reaching peak numbers, because then they get desperate and we just don't want them to jump across the food chain. So a misconception about not needing trapping, well, farmers are going to be calling because there's always going to be that issue where all of a sudden, when they start to get desperate, predators are going to maybe target a domestic animal like livestock or a domesticated pet, and we want to prevent that, because once a pro hunter predator realizes how easy a food source like that is, they won't go back to hunting wild. And if they're a pack, they could actually train others in their family to hunt that as well. We're trying to avoid these situations. So if we can be monitoring populations and preventing that peak disease from reaching, that's actually what trapping's about. That's the way we can watch it, monitor, stop, and prevent any desperation. And it keeps them out of the public's eye. Because right away when people are wondering, well, how come they're showing up? Was it something we did? When they have their own area, which Canada is. Canada is still mostly untouched wilderness. That's their home. But when they use all the resources in their area, and they've reached that peak, it's dangerous. It's dangerous for everything under it to replenish, and now they're going to start looking elsewhere. And that's the reason why they're coming into our homes. So that's why I feel like there is a need for trapping. And thirdly, the misconception that always tends to happen is just like any circumstance, there's going to be somebody who rarely on the occasion does it for the wrong reasons or is inexperienced. And those ones always seem to attract the public attention. And hunters and trappers alike sit back, and on those circumstances, it gives a bad name for everybody. But luckily that's rare, because experienced people respect conservation and they respect the game. And we want to find that happy balance. So my advice to people is, if you have any questions or concerns, you should go talk to a trapper, because their knowledge is invaluable. And out here at the Whitetail Fur Council, I've been mentored by a great group of guys, and they would talk your ear off. Social distance, of course.
Thanks for joining me today, Kyla. For those of you that want to check out the Whiteshell Trappers Museum, it is open between the May long weekend and the Thanksgiving long weekend, usually on weekends, but be sure to check out the Whiteshell Fur Council, or check out with an interpreter at manitobaparks.com for specifically when the museum is open. Once again, thanks a lot for joining me today, Kyla.
You're welcome.
It's always nice to get out of the office, isn't it? So with all that, one big question does remain a little bit with kind of the end of the fur trade, obviously not really a thing anymore. And for fur bearing coats that are still being made in the garment industry today, with a lot of those furs coming actually from fur farms, animals that are raised for their fur, just like we raise cows and chickens for food. The question is, who actually still traps in Manitoba in 2021? Well, Kyla does for sure. And there are people out there that, again, it's just their way of life. It was passed down from generation to generation, and that's what they do at this time of the year. Another big use that Kyla kind of alluded to when we were talking about the beaver is when conservation will get assistance from trappers to remove some nuisance or problem animals. Beavers are a great example because not only can they dam up a river that will flood out a highway, which makes cottage areas inaccessible by emergency vehicles, it can also do severe damage to the base of that road, which can ultimately mean the entire highway may have to be replaced, which, needless to say, is a very costly, very expensive endeavor there. Another common use for trapping today in 2021 is the problem predator removal system. So this is where landowners or farmers, particularly usually out in rural Manitoba, can enlist help in removing a problem predator, like say coyotes. What they do is they file a district occurrence report with a conservation office, and then the conservation officer will enlist the help of a trapper who is registered, excuse me, who is registered for that program. So those are some great examples of how trapping not only has evolved over the centuries, but is still in use and necessary in the Whiteshell and Manitoba as a whole today. Now, there are some things that we can do to make sure that all of these techniques are not lost to history. First off, making sure that we know all about the misinformation and misconceptions. One thing we didn't touch upon in the video was what animals can be trapped, or which ones of specific populations. So like Kyla had started to say, every population basically has a nice sustainable level. And it's when some of those animals from good seasons of, good food, good habitat, their number gets up over what is a sustainable level. So this surplus area here is what's allowed to be trapped. If an animal population all of a sudden goes under the sustainable level, then that season for trapping will be closed for that particular animal to allow their numbers to get back up to a sustainable level and eventually up into a surplus. But there's more ways that we can learn about trapping and gain an appreciation for it. For starters, in the spring, summer, and fall, we can come out to the Whiteshell and visit the Whiteshell Trappers Museum. That's where we shot all those videos, and that is a great way to learn more about trapping. Another thing we can do is learn about more of the local trapping done in your area. A great start for that is by reading this right here, the Manitoba Trapper's Guide. So just like with hunting and fishing, every year the province puts out a trapping guide. So in addition to the general rules and regulations, there's also, small changes that may occur from year to year. Again, just like with fishing or hunting. You can pick up a physical one of these at any park office, or even easier, you can go online to manitobaparks.com or just Google Manitoba Trapper Guide, and usually the first one up top is a PDF of this exact file here. To get a little more in depth with trapping and trapping regulations and techniques, you can also take the Trapper Certification course. So first off, if anybody does want to go out and trap, this is a required course. Much like with hunting, you have to complete the Hunter's Certification. Same thing with trapping. But even if you're not interested in physically going out onto the land and trapping animals, just taking that course is a great way to get a much more in-depth look and a better appreciation for trapping than I can offer in 15 to 20 minutes. The main thing you can do is just appreciate it. What you've done today, listening and inviting me into your home today, is a great first step towards that. And everything I just mentioned are some great ways to keep that going. Like I said at the beginning, trapping has gone from being a cornerstone industry that built this country to now being a sustainable, humane way of managing wildlife populations and dealing with problem wildlife. And as we learn more about trapping, we can gain an appreciation for this misunderstood method of wildlife harvesting and make sure that these techniques are not lost to the future or lost to history. I want to thank you all very much for joining me today. And now, if you haven't already, you can type your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll strive to answer as many as we can.
Thanks, Adam. Our first question here is from Vig, who asks, how do the conservation track the overall numbers of a species? They'd be widespread and so many, so curious how they count them.
For sure. So one of the ways is they do work with the trappers because they're physically out on the landscape. But for a lot of larger animals, they will actually do helicopter surveys because you hit it right on the head. There's a huge, vast area of land that has to be surveyed. And as cool as snowshoes are, helicopters are more efficient. So they'll do helicopter surveys to get approximations of how many animals are on the landscape. That's one method.
Sanyel asks, can you trap lynx?
Short answer, yes. Lynx, and it is one of the furs that I have behind me here. Lynx can be trapped in the whiteshell, but again, make sure you refer to the trapper's guide, because some years, and I remember lynx in specific was one of these, I can't remember what years, but the population of lynx had dipped below that sustainable level. So lynx trapping was closed for that season until the populations got up. But yes, in general, trapping for lynx, that is one of the species you can trap for.
That's all the questions for now.
All right. Well, then again, I'll thank you all very much for inviting me into your home today. And if this has made you hungry for more webinars, be sure to check out our next one on Saturday, January 23rd from 6:30 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. It's all about parks after dark. And if this is what your appetite to come out to provincial parks, we want to make sure that everybody remembers, when you do visit a park, follow COVID-19 public health regulations. Only visit with members of your own household. And if you do meet up with a friend, make sure to keep your group under 5 people and practice the fundamentals of physical distancing, staying 6 feet apart and wearing a mask. But once again, thank you very much for joining me this morning, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.